Thank you, Michelle.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bit of problem.
Alrighty-o. So, yes, thanks for joining me this afternoon. Oh, were you, Miriam, had you finished? Yeah?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you go
Yeah.
through. So 20 minutes and I'll give you a high five to tell you 5 minutes to go.
Yeah, I'm just moving you guys away because I can't see my own notes. Okay, so thanks for joining me. Should only be, not should only be, but about 15 minutes. I thought what I'd discuss today is the actual activities that were included in a 7-month-long critical participatory action research project that was designed to explore clinical teachers' experiences, challenges, tensions and rewards to inform the design of professional development that suited their needs. So we're still talking about design. It is important first, I guess, for the audience to share that the participants in their study were clinical teachers. They were nursing clinical teachers. So they're registered nurses working in supernumerary roles in this case, it was in a clinical acute hospital setting, and they work to supervise and support and assess ours and other vet and higher education organisations, nursing students, clinical learning. So because they are educating in a clinical setting, they often are not included or privy to the kinds of professional development that we receive within academia. So professional development for all of us, I guess, is empowering. It can be about career goals. It can be about meeting personal dream goals. It can be about putting effort into overcoming the impossible. And it is and always should be transformative. It can involve individuals, but also groups in personal and professional growth. We would like to think it harnesses creativity, so a bit similar here to what Tobias was just talking about. It also can embrace quirkiness and left of field ideas, as these two little gems on the screen have come up with. In particular, the fact they've got their safety gear on as well. So in the project we designed, the professional development had two contexts. The first context was for my own professional development because it was part of my doctoral study. So it was about learning a way of doing research as an RHD student. And it was also the individual and collective professional development for the participants in this study. As far as the research side of things, that's been published. And so I'm going to move away from the research and talk just a little bit, which is probably revision for most of you, about action research and how these methods are informed by many different philosophical and theoretical traditions. Some of the greats that you may have come across are Paulo Freire as a critical theorist and educator who worked to educate the poor. In particular, first by starting to understand and realize that the reason a lot of the poor in Brazil were not educated is because they were illiterate. So he started by teaching them to read and write. Kurt Lewin, known for his work as social psychology and applied research, particularly in group communication and dynamics. And Lewin is also sometimes referred to as the father of action research, which can be a bit disputed. There may be others that you might be aware of in your own discipline. For me, in nursing, I actually moved into using the work of Stephen Kemmis, who's an Australian, and Stephen argues that the approach is important for enhancing knowledge and teaching teachers practice change. So following on from learning about Stephen Kemmis and the action research method, what I actually used for this project was critical participatory action research. And in CPAR, this is when we use a critical theory lens to critique, consider, and seek to understand political, social, and cultural agendas that might be impacting practice. And to see if we can find ways for how we can challenge these agendas and make change to improve our working and living conditions. So similar to what Tobias was saying, in nursing and in clinical teaching, there's lots and lots of wicked problems. And so the only way sometimes to come up with those solutions is to apply a critical lens and understand those overarching ideas. So what did I do? I moved away from Chemis's work and went to the work of Stephen Brookfield, and I used his critical theory approaches to adult teaching and learning. So we've all heard of developing critical reflective teacher, but I moved more into his particular approaches that he used. And so what I did in the first meeting, so action research is also cyclical, and we intended to have 3 separate meetings. And so the first meeting was very much about introducing the group to the work of Stephen Brookfield. And I did that through a PowerPoint after we'd done a bit of group forming. I will just backstep a bit. The participants actually all knew each other. They're all from one large organisation, but they worked on 2 separate sites. And then there was me as an outsider, but an insider, because I've also worked in this space. And so we had to sort of form our group for our 3 meetings. And we did that in several ways, and this is one way. And so I developed this slides, PowerPoint, that we worked through. The other commonality with action research is that it's this continuing action and reflection process. And so I started straight away with having this first introduction using that same method. And the next couple of images are just a couple of excerpts from this PowerPoint that we worked through for about half an hour in the first part of the first meeting. So for instance, we talked about assumptions and what they are, and sort of just had a large group brainstorming session around what are our own assumptions. And then I gave examples that I had adapted myself from my own readings of Brookfield's work and applied them to some of our work as nurses, in particular as clinical teachers working with students. And then there were lots of these little activities. So we either had a discussion amongst ourselves or in pairs, or they all had notebooks and things that they could jot down some of their ideas, just to sort of get them thinking critically and get them warmed up, if you like. At the end of this slide, I thought it was important that we, as I said, we needed to form as a group, and we needed something that would keep us cohesive for these meetings. And so in some of the readings I've done, we came up with our own group contract, if you like. So the first one, to be a CF, was an example that I did before the workshop and brought it for them to have a look at. And facilitators, what they came up with in, I'm going to say, around about 10 minutes. It was really quick. And so whenever the next couple of meetings, I would just have that up on the whiteboard just to remind ourselves of what our common ground was. So after this sort of introduction, this first half an hour introduction, I wanted them to break into small groups and start looking at their own challenges and before we did that, we also had a bit of a conversation following on through these slides of how we were going to investigate these everyday challenges and wicked problems, ways of being collaborative, which is how we came up with our group contract, and things that started to think around how we might be able to change culture to make our working lives a bit better. And so breaking into small groups, I didn't know whether the team would actually have their own challenges to talk about. So I used a lot of trigger material, and these tables were set up around the room with books that I'd read. Some of them were marked with my own notes. And I also had these trigger statements, which are taken from the literature. And I did notice quite a few of them took some of these trigger statements, but interestingly enough, they were left sitting on tables at the side. So these guys were really ready they knew what their challenges were. And to my knowledge, they'd never participated in something like this before. And they just got down, and we had allocated an hour for them to work in their small groups. And it was really difficult to stop them after about an hour and a half. So it was really easy for them. They knew their wicked problems, and just talking about them, sort of trying to find common ground as teams rather than individuals as well. After they'd had that time in small groups, a nominated leader, of course, fed back to the larger group. And because it was research, it was all digitally recorded. They had notes, which I asked if they wanted to leave their notes for me, could they? And some did and some didn't. And so at the end of that, we sort of finished there. So the meetings were designed to be about between 2 and 3 hours. And so once we'd worked through this process of identifying all these challenges that had come out of the small group work, we just moved then to making a date for the second meeting, which we made 4 weeks later. And then we all had some jobs. So my job, of course, was to take all this information and, because it was research, have a look at the what themes were emerging. And their job, all I asked them to do is just to think about things that might be different for them in their work after they'd had this experience in meeting 1, and to sort of look critically around at some of the things they might be able to change, or ways they might be able to change, so that they could start to transform their practice and work and excel in their roles. I didn't really have much communication with any of them between the first and second meeting. And so when we came back to the second meeting, after a quick warm-up exercise, it wasn't an icebreaker because they all knew each other. It was just a quick chat and how we're going, and we're getting to work now on these challenges and start looking at some solutions. And then I put up this slide. And this slide was my theming, if you will. And I said to them, with all the data that you gave me and your jottings and notes and the conversations that had been recorded, these are the things that I found were coming out of the data. So you seem to be struggling mostly with these things, that you have this identity as a clinician and another one as an educator, and that you have this conflict or tension between students are doing tasks on the floor, but what you really want to do is see students thinking more because you're coming from an education background. And they did have this tension around negotiating and challenging to make their work practice a bit better. And one of the ideas that one of the examples that came up there is that each facilitator has 8 students. And sometimes when the students are really hard going, this one facilitator is struggling a lot, and yet the other facilitator beside them might be sailing along quite happily. And so they'd not really sort of talked about, well, is there a way that we can maybe share students or offload students? And so they were the sort of things that had come up in negotiating and challenging. What I wanted them to do, or what I asked them to do now, was we needed to sort of harmonize these tensions. And the theoretical underpinning in this is dialectical behavioral therapy, because one of my supervisors is a mental health nurse. And I won't go into that, but we wanted not to do this because what they said to me in meeting 1 was, or what I heard in the data was things like it's us and them, or it's clinicians versus us as educators. And so what we wanted to do is say, well, you're sort of both. So the one way to get a solution is to have you thinking as a clinician and as an educator, and having you value doing as well as thinking. So we wanted to work towards harmonizing the tensions, and we wanted the solutions to be exciting and transformative, and solutions that would work for them so that they could use them and excel in their role. So what we did in this meeting 2, again, was break into small groups. I can't remember if they were the same in each group. I don't think they were. And they just started brainstorming using butcher's paper. Some of them chose the same theme, so there was a bit of a double up. And what I ended up walking away with was these big reams of butcher's paper where they'd scribbled all over them, and they were priceless because most of them had the solutions there. And so this workshop also went on for just over 2 hours, and we didn't actually get to nutting out all the solutions. But when I looked at all this work, they were all there. For instance, this one down the bottom, what is a facilitator and what does a facilitator do? The digital recording of that group, they actually went on, and while they were doing all this writing, they were talking about we need more than a job description to share with our colleagues, because people don't really know what we do. We need like a charter. So that became one of the outputs. And so my job was to work on this data and see if I could come up with some solutions that were meaningful to them. Most of that work actually took place via email. So what you see here is a charter. I happened to be trolling through the organisation's website and found this template, which is actually what they use for their clients in one of their mental health institutions. So I used the same format, the same heading, and just put all their data on there. As I said, that it was one large team on 2 sites. One of the sites decided they didn't like this rights. They didn't want it. They felt it was a bit overbearing and dominant that they go along with their rights as a facilitator when they're trying to get people to be more collegial and understand what they do. So I believe one of them probably took that out. Some of the other solutions were two team members partnered with me, and we made a series of 3 podcasts, which were around what is it like to be a facilitator, how do I become a facilitator, where do I get professional development, and they talked about things like putting quizzes about facilitation and educating students into mandatory training for other nurses who weren't facilitators. They also talked about doing like huddles, 5-minute huddles, which are becoming rather common now. This was back in 2019. And so, yeah, there were quite a lot of outputs, and whether they've continued to work on them, I'm not sure. One of the other really big outputs is something that my colleague Jen Mulvogue and I will be presenting tomorrow morning. In meeting 2, it became really apparent that some clinical teachers were very stressed working with students that suffer mental health concerns. So a long story around, which we'll share tomorrow, it ended up being myself and Jen that did the PD for them. So most of this group has actually attended the PD for that, which is another 3-hour workshop. The ones that haven't, it was thwarted by COVID. So we've tried 3 times this year to have it down in Brisbane, and it hasn't happened. And now they're tentatively booked for February, hopefully. So just because it was a research project, I thought I'd share some final words from the participants. So it's really interesting. Some of these participants had been clinical teachers for 10 years. I think only one had been a facilitator for less than 12 months. So they admitted that it was hard doing this work, and it is hard, and I'll share my lessons in a minute. But there you see some of the things that they got out, and, kudos to the participant who said she'd come up with all these ideas she was going to keep sharing with her manager to make their work easier. So my lessons learnt, it is difficult, confronting and challenging. I certainly learnt a lot as a novice researcher and research participant that spent the last 4 years studying clinical teaching. I still learnt so much throughout this process. It is difficult, so be prepared if you're going to do something like that. I had loads more activities, and I left it up to the participants to decide in each meeting really what they were going to do. But I really do think, like Tobias said before me, taking the time to collaborate, and I think Ian said it too, with intended target groups around what they need, and us understanding what it is that their challenges are. And even if we can't do that, just having conversations, even if we don't get to the outputs, if we just create space for these critical conversations so that people can start to look and make changes to their practice as educators. And I will just say that finally, this approach and actually reading the information about this theme in this conference, it really did introduce participants to ways of examining their practice, and it offered them an opportunity to engage in scholarship and scholarly activity at a higher education level that they don't normally get involved in. And that's something working forwards that I'm going to strive to bring them more into academia, because they are clinicians, but they're also educators as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. You've almost done my wrap up for me by tying everything else together. I was thinking about that's actually one of the themes, is that empathy and understanding where somebody's coming from that we have seen with all three, like ego, empathize, and then similar understanding where your participants are coming from. Does anybody have any questions for Colleen though before I do a wrap up? Thank you very much for your presentation. Really interesting and quite empowering, it sounds like that process was for your clinicians. So really encouraging and very practical works. But questions?
Well, not so much a question maybe, but that was great, Colleen. And, it's kind of funny listening to you talking it through, even though you're coming from a participatory action research lens, but your whole approach, it could be easily seen as a social innovation process, and even some of the stuff is, directly aligned with what we refer to as human-centered design. So I think it was just, it fitted well in with that. And I was thinking it'd be interesting to do some project, and I have thought about it before, because I was interested in participatory action research years ago, and I've read Paulo Freire's books years ago as well. So, but combining those and see how social innovation and participatory action research, fit together, and how they actually are, can, feed from each other in some way. So it'd be interesting to have further conversations about that. But have you thought about that? This is in some ways an example of a social innovation taking this particular approach. Is that something you've included in how you're thinking about it, or?
It is, but I don't think in depth. I think I've been so busy getting the thesis ready for submission for examination. But look, there's way more to that project. We came up with, there's 2 papers came out of the project around, like I said, dialectical behavioural therapy. So yes, social innovation, I guess, definitely. I also applied border theory to the way these people work, or this group of educators work. And so we've developed a model that shows them how to be like clinician and educator, and how to live and work in spaces. So I think it definitely is social innovation. I'd love to have a chat. I just don't think I've had time to really think about it a lot in that light, but it definitely is. I will share, I took it out because my presentation was too long. The larger group, the larger site, actually pulled out of the 3rd meeting. So I got this big, long, massive email saying that they were really busy and they'd learned a lot and everything. But I felt it in the 2nd meeting. They were struggling with being critical. And when we were looking at negotiating and challenging, there were things there that I'm not going to talk about, but they shared in the group, and I just think some of it was just way too hard for them. That's a reflection for me. I'm not sorry that it went that way, but it was really interesting. That email to read was very interesting. So yes, let's do it, Tobias, but
let's keep
it's
talking.
going to be hard.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Colleen or comments about her project? Yeah, it does sound like we've just scratched the surface, I think.